Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all, now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is now in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the Governor General. Announcements by Your Honor the President.
I've heard from Senator Boyce, who regrets that he would not be able to join us today. Yes, also advised that Senator Tate has indicated that she will not be able to join us today as well.
No late.
Oh, I'm sorry, she will be late. We have available the minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, July the 15th, 2020, to be confirmed.
Mr. President, I beg that the aforementioned minutes be now confirmed.
The question is that the minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, July the 15th, 2020, be now confirmed. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The minutes of the meeting indicated have been confirmed.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Mr. President, I'm commanded to lay the Police Special Constables Discipline Regulations 2020.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate and moved by ministers.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 45.2 and 22.1 for the remainder of today's sitting to allow us to complete our business.
Question is that standing orders 45.2 and 22.1 be suspended for the balance of today's sitting. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. And the standing orders indicated have now been suspended.
Introduction of bills.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the following resolutions. A resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Cap 2225, to approve the lease to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital Board of 2 parcels of land, the property of the Crown situated at Martindale's Road in the parish of St. Michael in this island, for the purpose of the provision of health services and to facilitate development programs. A resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, Cap 228, the compulsory acquisition by the Crown of the parcel of land together with the building there on the property of Valerie Angelique Hamlin, situated at Bell Plain in the parish of St. Andrew in this island for the public purpose, says of establishing a site of historic and heritage interest. A resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, Cap 228, the compulsory acquisition by the Crown of the parcels of land situated at Friendship in the parish of St. Michael in this island for the public purpose, namely the development of a national botanical garden, and a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, Cap 228, the compulsory acquisition by the Crown of the parcel of land situated at Lot 1, Bush Hall Yard Gap, in the parish of St. Michael in this island for the public purpose of youth participation in community improvement projects known as the Building Blocks Projects. I also would like to give notice of the following bills. The Police Amendment Number 2 Bill, 2020. The Resolution Life Assurance Company Limited Transfer of Bonds Bill, 2020. Remediation Agreements Deferred Prosecutions Bill, 2020. I also now beg to move the first reading of the Police Amendment Number 2 Bill, 2020. The Resolution Life Assurance Company Limited Transfer of Bonds Bill, 2020. And the Remediation Agreements Deferred Prosecutions Bill, 2020.
Question is that the bill The question is that the following bills be now read the first time. Police Amendment Number 2 Bill, 2020. Resolution Life Assurance Company Limited Transfer of Bonds Bill, 2020. And Remediation Agreements Deferred Prosecutions Bill, 2020. Question is that those three mentioned bills be now read the first time. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 2, in the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to resume debate on the second reading of the Integrity in Public Life Bill 2020.
I recognize Senator Grant.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. President. I stand this morning to give my full support to this bill which is before this honorable chamber. And I want to start, sir, first by reflecting on the objects and reasons. And it states, sir, that this bill would establish a regime, including an integrity commission, to promote the integrity of persons in public life and strengthen measures for the prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution of acts of corruption, alter the Constitution and to the extent necessary for the purpose and provide for related matters. Sorry, start by reflecting on the objects and reasons, because I think that that segment of the bill communicates in a very deliberate way what is being sought to be achieved. Sir, we all know that there are those who suggest that persons in public life, and sometimes they're referring specifically to the political class, that sometimes what persons say they don't really mean. Sometimes you do not get the level of honesty and trust, and there isn't the level of ethics that one would expect. And I think, sir, that what this bill is clearly demonstrating is that this party in government recognizes the significant obligation which it has to the country to ensure that the framework is created where persons can properly recognize that individuals involved in public life must be held to a high standard. Let me say, Mr. President, that I believe that this bill is appropriate in reflecting on all persons at the senior level in public life. I do not believe, sir, and I'm going to spend some time a little later speaking to the issue of why it is that we should include persons other than the political class. But I see this bill as creating an opportunity to renew trust with respect to persons in public life. And it is important, sir, that we create the framework that allows the public to have the confidence in those of us who function in the public arena. And you know, sir, I heard the leader of government business as he made, in his introduction, he made reference to the former late Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Owen Arthur, and some remarks that Prime Minister Arthur had made. And I well remember there was an occasion when Prime Minister Arthur was speaking about another member of Parliament. And I would never forget the words that he used. And he indicated to the Parliament that he felt that the individual in question, who was referred to as well by the leader of government business, that individual had no moral minimum. And I remember those words well. Of course, we got to observe, sir, later issues in relation to Clico and the reference of the same individual. And I start at that point, sir, because I believe it is important for us to recognize that the government has taken a significant position to bring forward this piece of legislation. Sir, is it perfect? Mr. President, most things are not perfect. But is the objective one that we all should rally around? I say yes, sir, that it is important. It is important for us to create that framework where the public can have trust in public officials. It is important, sir, that we are able to signal to the public that as a government, we are not prepared to tolerate or to accept corruption. Mr. President, I do not have to remind members of this chamber of all of the talk that we heard in Barbados prior to the 2018 general election. In fact, all the talk that we heard between 2008 and 2018, which related to corruption. In fact, the general sentiment from the Barbadian public is that they want a fella, that they believe that between the period of 2008 and 2018, that there was significant corruption taking place, and they are calling for somebody to pay the price, and that is somebody here in Barbados and not over and away in another country. And sir, it is a very serious thing when people do not have the confidence in those that have been elected to do the right thing. So I believe that this bill, which relates, in my view, to restoring honesty and trust and ensuring that there are good ethics within government, is very, very important. I want, sir, to reflect on the words of a British historian and politician, Lord Acton, who said, I believe it was in 1857, that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I quote that, sir, because public officials, in my view, have spheres of influence, have areas of power. And if we reflect on Lord Acton's words, that power tends to corrupt, it is important that those who are exerting influence and those who have power within the governance structure, it is important, sir, that there are checks and balances, and it is important that legislation such as this includes those individuals as well. And sir, if it is that there's other legislation, as I've heard posited in this chamber, that there's other legislation that could properly deal with senior public servants, I say to this chamber that even if that is the case, there's no harm in having legislation such as this, which helps to reinforce the importance of protecting integrity in public life. So I want, sir, to encourage senators who may otherwise think that you should not include public servants and that you should only restrict this to the political class. I want to encourage them to give some thought to the recognition that it cannot hurt to include public servants as well, even if that is provided in other legislation. I'm not sure that it is, sir, because the senator who made the claim, I can't recall that he referenced any specific legislation with regard to this issue. But the point that I'm making, sir, is that even if it does exist, then there's absolutely nothing with reinforcing it here as well. And what does the legislation speak to? Or who does the legislation speak to? The legislation speaks, yes, to the political class, chairmen of boards and permanent secretaries. I heard persons in this chamber while the debate was taking place last week, Wednesday, on this legislation, speak to the fact that there are times people question how someone working in a particular position could afford some material things that they are seen with. And the references made, those references were not simply made to the political class. It was also made with reference to others in the public service as well. And I'm sure, sir, that all of us are aware of all different kinds of of stories that go around Barbados that if you want to get this permit or this license, that certain things have to be done. If you want to import this or import that, certain things have to be done. I am aware, sir, that there was a senior public servant who was transferred because it was observed that that individual was operating a company contrary to what he should have been doing. That person, sir, did not belong to the political class. So I think it is right, it is fitting, and it is proper for the legislation to include permanent secretaries, chairmen of statutory boards, chief executive officers, and senior managers. I believe, sir, that that is critical. And we all know of the allegations, as I've said, that have been made, not just about the political class, but about other persons functioning in public life as well. Mr. President, I want to spend just a few minutes speaking to clauses 26 and 27 of this bill. And I think, sir, that those clauses are extremely important. Clause 26, sir, deals with the complaint to commission regarding contravention of the Act. And clause 27, duty of persons exercising public functions to report contravention of Act. Sir, I previously said that I certainly get the sense that there is a public sentiment that persons want to see somebody be in charge with respect to the level of corruption that John Public saw between the years 2008 and 2018. Sir, you know better than I that in law, there's what is known as the presumption of innocence. A man is innocent until proven guilty. You also, sir, know better than I that evidence is critical within a criminal trial and in terms of securing a conviction. Sir, I dare say, sir, that you know better than I that sometimes attorneys at law make submissions to ensure that certain evidence is not permissible because the particular case may have a strong bearing on whether or not the outcome of a particular case may have a strong bearing on whether or not that piece of evidence is admissible. And sir, you again know better than I and the learned attorneys in this chamber that sometimes the evidence that is collected is not collected in the right manner. And the court at times is forced to throw the evidence. And I spend a little time referencing that because, sir, you know, while the public sentiment is that we want somebody, nobody is coming forward to provide the evidence that is necessary to create a credible case for there to be a conviction. So I am therefore happy, sir, with clauses 26 and 27, because I believe that there is a responsibility on the individuals who observe any wrongdoing to speak out. We can't, sir, just simply say that we want things to change, but we are not prepared ourselves to take the action necessary to change the system. Sir, you know, there is a concept in law again, and forgive me, there's a concept in law again known as transferred malice. Sir, you know it better than me. Huh? In fact, we had a case of a well-known person, a person by the name of Winston Hall. Huh? My understanding is of the case, sir, that he was involved in is that he might not have been the one who committed the crime, but he was there. He was there. He had served what the attorneys would call the mens rea. And he also engaged in the actus reus. That is what the attorneys would refer to, both the mental capacity as well as engaging in the actual act. He had that, and if sir, I was taking a gun to shoot at a person A, to kill person A, but I shot person B, and person B died. Sir, although my mental intention might not have been to kill person B, the malice is transferred. There is transferred malice. I wish my colleague senator was here to hear a little law. But I'm sure he's listening. I'm sure he's listening. The point is though, sir, that evidence is important. And therefore, those who see wrongdoing have a responsibility to act and to assist the system so that we could eliminate corruption. I think that is important, sir. Sir, I'm going to just speak very briefly to Part 2, clauses 3 to 10, which relate to the Integrity Commission and how the commission is set up. And I'm referencing that, sir, because I think it is adequate, proper, for us to reflect on the fact that we're not just talking, but we're putting the substance in place with the commission to make sure that the commission can get its work done. And that is critical. Very often, sir, you hear of the talk. And if we look at the history, really in relation to integrity in public life, the truth is that the discussion did not start in 2018. The discussion started long before that. In fact, I believe, sir, it would be appropriate to say that the discussion started as early as the 1970s. But we are now seeing it here in legislation before us. And that speaks volumes, I think, to the government. So I also want to point out Part 3, which deals with the issues of incomes and assets and liabilities, not only for the person who is functioning in public life, but for their spouse as well. And we know, sir, how the system operates, sir. We know, there's reference in the clause, I believe, to trust and blind trust. We know we are mature persons in this chamber, but we understand how trusts are used. And when I say trust, I speak in the legal concept. But the legislation speaks to trusts and blind trusts and ensuring that you make a declaration. And it points out, sir, how very, very serious this legislation is. Sir, there is a significant focus on the political class. And I'm not denying, sir, that there should be. During the presentation of the Deputy President, he spoke about politically exposed persons. Mr. President, when Senator Greenidge was speaking in relation to that, I remember going to my bank. I was traveling on business. And I went to my bank to purchase foreign currency. I had $2,500 in cash. Of course, sir, you know, when you travel, you get a per diem. And I went as part of the per diem and part of the hotel accommodation monies to change 2,500 Barbados dollars. And this is at my bank, the bank that I have been dealing with for numerous years. And they told me that I had to fill out a source of funds. And I asked, why, well, this is only $2,500. They told me it did not come from off of your account. And you are a politically exposed person. I went with my daughter to purchase a vehicle. And I had so many papers to sign. I felt somewhat as if, you know, you were being targeted for the decision to be involved at this level. I say that, sir, because I think that while we talk about politically exposed persons, that sometimes the requirements are sometimes they're vigorous, sometimes they are stringent, sometimes in my view, sir, you know, they do not reflect in a practical kind of way what really needs to happen. But it is the environment in which we're in, and it is the environment with which we have to continue to function. Before I close, sir, I just want to speak very briefly to a comment made by Senator Dr. Rogers. And I did speak with him before, but I felt it important for me to also highlight the issue here in this chamber. And Senator Rogers, Dr. Rogers, I believe, cautioned how political parties in government, particularly those with an overwhelming majority, such as the Barbados Labour Party, should function. And I believe that he indicated that he did not think that chairpersons of statutory boards should report to party conferences. I, sir, have a different view. And let me tell you why I have a different view. And let me say up front that I do accept the caution, Senator Dr. Rogers, because I think when there is an overwhelming majority that you do have to ensure that there's no perception of any action that could erode government and the highest principles with respect to governance. But, sir, political parties, and the Barbados Labour Party has an annual conference every year. And at the annual conference, there are resolutions that are discussed, and those resolutions relate to important areas within the country, whether it is the fixing of roads, the functioning of the healthcare system, the need for infrastructural improvement and development. And from that perspective, I think it is important amongst the rank and file of the party to hear from those that are appointed and leading the charge at statutory corporations as to what is happening, and for them to be able to ask questions and to have their questions answered. Because, you know, sir, yes, the chairpersons are appointed by the ministers, but the ministers are there, sir, because they are, by and large, part of a party system, and where the majority of those that are of the same party have been elected to office. I understand, sir, and accept that the Constitution of Barbados does not recognize political parties. But while it does not recognize political parties, all of us know that when a general election is called, there are a number of candidates that go under the banner of a political party. And in the case of the Barbados Labour Party, we always bring credible candidates to the public of Barbados. Always. And sir, it is therefore not, in my view, outrageous for those who have the political power coming from the people to be speaking with the people, to give the people the opportunity to interact and to offer their own opinion and to quiz them, sir, on how they are functioning in government. But I do take, Senator Rogers, as I said, your caution, and I think it is something that we do have to keep in the forefront of our minds. I accept that there needs to be the separation of powers, and that we have to ensure that there is no perception of consolidation of power. But at the same time, we have to create the opportunity for the ordinary man and the ordinary woman to be able to interact and to get feedback from those who function in government as well, and those that they've given their confidence to represent them. Mr. President, as I conclude, I want to go back to a previous statement that I made. And that statement is that this bill before us may not be perfect, but the objective of the bill is one which I think we all can embrace. And if there's something of note, and I heard the Deputy President on a previous occasion indicate when he was discussing a particular bill that he was sure that he had discussed it already. The reality is that what is happening is that the government is bringing significant legislation, and that legislation is coming one by one by one by one. So you will not necessarily see every single thing, sir, in this bill. But be assured that in the same manner that the government has had the testicular fortitude to bring this piece of legislation, there will be other pieces of legislation coming to provide, sir, support and to ensure that we do our part as a political party to facilitate integrity in public life. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Senator Nurse, now your turn. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me and giving me an opportunity to speak on this proposed legislation. Mr. President, I think this legislation is very, very important at this time. Not necessarily because we have been jolted within recent times of situations where people in public life have been called before the court to answer for certain wrongdoings. But I think we recognize that there are lots of reasons why this legislation is maybe coming at this time. For example, we know that more and more international agencies, particularly lending agencies, etc., are putting some pressure on us to ensure that this type of legislation is on the books. We recognize that watchdog agencies like the tax persons who look after tax and make policies around the world, the EU and the OECD and so on, are more and more insisting on this types of and pieces of legislation being part of our overall laws. And whatever the case may be that as it may, for me, it is important because I see integrity as being the quality of being honest and having some strong principles which you are refusing to change. And we have to ensure that when people come into public life, they come because they genuinely have something to offer and not because they see it as an opportunity that they may be able to enrich their own lives. And so politicians in particular definitely should be, there should be some control for those who enter that field, because I think it was mentioned probably in the discussion last week that while we are looking to put this legislation on the books, this does not necessarily mean that it makes, it gives a person integrity. So it is not something that we can legislate, but it has to be something within you, within each and every one of us, that we feel that we aspire and we stick to at all times. And it must start with those who lead. It must start with what we normally refer to when we talk about governance as the tone at the top. Those in particular who lead must make sure that they set that very high standard that all who follow must adhere to. And whenever you start out wrong, if there's some inkling that you have a particular administration that is lacking in some way in integrity, it tends to flow down to all the other individuals in that particular administration, to the persons who work in the civil service. And so you find that overall, the whole integrity of government and the civil service will tend to decline. And I believe also strongly, not only the politicians, but civil servants. There are a number of civil servants in very high positions, permanent secretaries, heads of departments, and so on, who can be influenced, or who could be influenced if they don't have a high level of integrity. And therefore we must ensure that we put legislation into place to at least act as a deterrent against such practices. I remember our civil service, and I must say, Mr. President, that I am not of the view that there's any huge, widespread crooked people acting in our service. So generally, I think we still have a pretty good civil service, but we must keep it so. I recall people, top civil servants who we looked up to, Sir Carlisle Burton, for example, Sir Neville Osborne. And these were the people who eschewed an extremely high level of integrity, and who led the civil service with great dignity. And we need to ensure that the civil service, if it has dropped, if there's any indication that it has dropped within recent times, can be brought back to those days of really top-level, outstanding civil servants with very high integrity. Mr. President, I support the legislation in principle, but there are some issues I do have with the legislation. For example, and this I think it may have been raised already, but I noticed, for example, we have included the Director of Public Prosecutions. We have included the magistrates in this legislation. We've included the Auditor General in this legislation, but for some reason, and I would really like to get a clear understanding of why we have omitted the judges from this legislation. I think they are one of the group of persons who could very well have challenges of not meeting the highest level of integrity. And I think that they too should, like the rest of the people in the civil, other persons in the civil service, like the DPP, like the Auditor General, as I said, like the magistrates, like the civil magistrates, should all be subject to the same level of scrutiny. And I really need to hear why the reasons for their being omitted from this bit of legislation. Mr. President, I would have also liked to see in this legislation relating to campaign financing, either in this legislation or in some other legislation, but legislation relating to campaign financing for political parties. I mean, there is no question. And I'm not talking about the little $50,000 or $30,000 that you see that is disclosed by individual politicians after an election, for their specific expenses. But the majority, the bulk of the financing which parties use to finance their campaigns comes from the huge, from the persons in the business community, who will undoubtedly expect certain favors in return for giving campaign financing. And so I think that the time has come when campaign financing it has to be regulated. It has to be regulated. It has to be disclosed. You have to know the persons who are contributing $1 million, $500,000 to a particular party or parties. We cannot go on like this. At the end of the day, they expect to be repaid for their contributions. And Mr. President, the thing about this is that we are talking about trying to become more efficient in the civil service. If for example, we have or a government find itself in a situation where they have to award particular contracts, some contract to a particular group or a particular organization, it affects all of us eventually, because at the end of the day, government has to pay those contracts. But where do they get the money from? It's all of us, every individual who contributes to it through our taxes. And if you are if you are arriving at a situation where you are awarding contracts which are not necessarily as cost efficient as they should be, then eventually we are going to be called upon to provide the funding. And so it behooves all of us to ensure that we have public officials and that we put politicians and governments in place who are going to be prepared to adhere to this very strict level of integrity. Mr. President, it is also, I think, going to be very important if this legislation is going to be as effective as we want it to be, to have some whistleblower legislation in place. You know, civil servants know a lot about what is going on and what is happening. And I am sure that they can provide lots of information, but they don't come forward because of a fear of being shunted, a fear of that may affect them in their job. And therefore, they don't necessarily come forward with the information, or even in situations where they feel or they have reason to believe that there's something not right. You know, you get an instruction from the minister to do something, to provide award a contract or something to Mr. X company or Y company. And you never get anything in writing. And I've heard servants of this, you don't get anything in writing. But you know, you know, and you have a strong feeling that something is going wrong. And they certainly, not only civil servants, but the public in general should really have that opportunity and that right to be able to provide information to this commission if they believe that there's something going wrong. So I think that legislation will also be important to support this integrity bill. And of course, I think in the bill itself, Mr. President, I would have liked to see the situation where gains and assets that can be identified as being obtained from an act of corruption should be forfeited. So, you know, there should be some level of, some thing in here which says if the commission can prove that some contract was entered in corruptly, and there was corruption behind it, and that somebody gained, you know, a huge bank account or something, that they should be able to move after that individual and recover those funds which really rightly belong to the state. And I think it is what I am envisaging, Mr. President, is something similar to, you know, if someone who is found guilty of peddling in drugs, for example, and you know, you're talking about huge quantities here, and they have developed over time a certain living and you know, cars and have acquired a living which you really cannot identify with the level of income, that you should be able to go after them and to recover such assets and such gains. I also think, and this is probably more like companion legislation, which is going to be necessary again, also is the establishment of contractor general. Again, important because we have to be able to ensure, and this is a point I alluded to earlier, that we have to be ensured that contracts are given out based on efficiency and not necessarily because it contains some level of excess costing, which then acts as some kickback to somebody. And I know that in Jamaica, for example, where there's a contractor general in place, it has not up to date, to be perfectly honest, Mr. President, reached the level of efficiency that we are hoping to see coming out of the contractor general. Of course, a large part of that problem is because of the lack of resources in a lot of cases. So if you're going to set up departments like contractor general and so on, and then don't give them the amount of resources that are necessary to see the job done in an efficient manner, then you're not going to, the legislation is not going to have the effect which you are intending it to have. And so those are the aspects of this legislation that I think that we need to be now put in place as a complement to this overall legislation. And to make sure that Barbados continues to, Barbados' civil service, I should say, continues to operate at a very high level of integrity. Transparency International Corruption Perception Index has ranked us in 2019 as number 30 out of 179 countries, so not bad. But of course, when you consider that in the previous year we were at 26, it tells you that there is seems to be some slippage in the perception of integrity in Barbados. And so I think that, and I hope that putting this legislation in place will help to mitigate against a lot of those issues that we see that needed to be addressed. And so, as I wrap up, Mr. President, there's just one other little point I must make, and I must also say that while this speaks to integrity in the public sector, we need to recognize that the private sector also has issues, and it is in a lot of cases people from the private sector who try to influence those in the public sector in terms of getting contracts or getting favors. And so it is a two-way thing. My parents, I used to hear them say, one hand can't clap. And so it has to be that you have both the private sector and the public sector working together and insisting that the highest level of integrity is maintained. And with those few words, Mr. President, I am obliged to you.
Senator Tate, your turn is next.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as usual, my focus is going to be on the legislation, and in particular, certain section schedules of this bill, because it is a comprehensive piece of legislation, or proposed piece of legislation. It is comprehensive. I believe it has over 100 pages. I could be wrong. Let me see. Let me check. Yes, it is over 100 pages in legislation, Mr. President. It is far-reaching. We've heard all manner of description. Senator Moore called it intrusive. The government senators are saying it is necessary. I am not going to debate that today. My issue and my focus will be the importance, the very importance of this type of legislation, Mr. President, is such that it demanded, in my opinion, publication and circulation within the wider Barbados. Yes, we had a joint select committee for this bill. I sat on that committee. But even during those meetings, I would have said, this type of legislation and the impact that it is going to have on certain people was such that it was imperative that the persons to be affected and the country at large should have been made aware of the intricacies of this legislation. It is all well and good to speak of the need for the legislation because we are global and we need to show that we have integrity and that we're stamping out corruption and we want to be recognized in the regional and international markets. That is fine. There's no quarrel there. There's no quarrel there, Mr. President. But the way this bill will change people's lives, it was necessary. I mean, I don't even understand it. I don't understand how this piece of legislation was not shared at town hall meetings, as I said, at the Joint Select Committee meetings, or there was not public sensitization. We have GIS that could have allowed for that to happen. We have locations that would have allowed for it to happen. Now, to suggest that it couldn't happen because the select committee had certain terms and conditions and certain references, terms of reference, as I have been made to understand, terms of reference can be amended. You go back to the source and get them amended. I don't understand the apparent desire to slip this in. Yes, persons were invited to make submissions to the Joint Select Committee, Mr. President. As I said, I sat on the committee. But those were submissions that persons had to come to the Senate chamber to make. And I would be bold to say that the persons who made both oral and written submissions are not the persons who are going to be affected by this bill and eventual act if it is passed. And on that note, Mr. President, the mere fact that this bill will require a 2/3 majority because it will lead to a constitutional amendment suggests that that by and of itself makes it important enough to be shared in the public domain, beyond being invited to make written and oral submissions in an environment where persons will not necessarily want to be present. There's a difference between appearing before a committee in the Senate chamber and making a submission at a town hall meeting in an area where you are familiar, where you will have your neighbors and your communities supporting you and persons of like mindset. This bill is going to affect public servants who are already in position, who can do nothing about the bill once it is passed and what the bill is calling for. But beyond that, this bill is going to affect the public servant spouses and their dependent children. And for those persons who are currently single, Mr. President, who may have someone who was trying to marry them, this bill mashing up the marriage prospects for some people, Mr. President. This is a serious piece of legislation here, Mr. President. I'm just saying. Let that just ruminate for a minute. Here we have a bill to promote the integrity of persons in public life and strengthen measures for the prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution of acts of corruption, alter the Constitution to the extent necessary for the purpose and provide for related matters. This is what the objects or reasons of this piece of legislation says. And I understand that passing this legislation was one of the promises that the government gave during elections. I get it. But, and I'm not in any way suggesting that the legislation is not necessary. I'm not in any way suggesting that the legislation, there's need for it. I may have an opinion on who should be affected by the legislation. But make no bones about it, Mr. President. It is such that it should not be, you pass it and then sensitize people. You pass it and then tell people what they're facing. There are two things wrong with that, Mr. President. One, when you do that, even if you have meetings after the passing of the legislation, there's no requirement to take on what people have said because the law has already been passed, Mr. President. So you have just given lip service to something that has a fait accompli. So to me, that is fairly disingenuous, and that's just, you're trying to, for lack of a better word, trick people, placate people, make people feel that you are having a conversation with them and you care. My other issue, and this is the one that is fundamental, when you meet with the people and you actually take on what they have suggested, but the bill has already been passed, we're talking amendments. Too many amendments. Too many amendments, Mr. President. Just now we're not going to know what the law is on a particular topic because we have so many amendments. We come, we pass a piece of legislation, then you find out, oh, well, you forgot this, you forgot that. So we are on amendment number 345 on some of the pieces of legislation that we have done so far. So I have a challenge with pass and then discuss. Pass and then change. Pass and then do nothing. What is the challenge with sharing this in the public domain first, and then sharing it, and then seeking to finalize a document that has been shared with the public? And Senator Drake, Mr. President, made reference to a letter that was submitted by the Governor General of Barbados. I believe that this would have been referred to in the minutes of one of the Joint Select Committee meetings sometime back in 2018, because we had a number of meetings. And in that letter, according to the reference, and I was there, the Governor General herself had indicated concern and had indicated...
You sure, Senator, that the Governor General forms properly any part of the debate?
Well, Mr. President, I'm making reference to what formed part of the Joint Select Committee report and the fact that she had called for public sensitization and town hall meetings.
I'm not going to permit it because the law excludes it. And it's not the first time that you have introduced the Governor General in debate. It is wholly improper.
Mr. President,
So
I'm only making reference.
Please be guided.
Yes, I'm guided, Mr.
That letter
President.
ought never to have come either. All of that is improper. Please don't refer to it.
Mr. President, I'm guided. I was just making reference to Senator Drake's and the fact that it was in the minutes. That's all I was doing, Mr. President. I'm not trying to bring any improper behavior to the Senate. But I'm guided by the President, Mr. President. As I continue, Mr. President, as far as this bill is concerned, I would have indicated at the committee that if the bill itself was not going to be circulated at large, let us at least circulate the second schedule. And I believe one or two of the persons who made submissions in relation to the bill and in relation to the committee meetings had also suggested publication of the second schedule. I maintain my position today, sir, as I then said it back in 2018, that the persons referred to in the second schedule need to know what is happening and could happen to them. They are referred to as specified persons in public life. And when one looks at the definition of a specified person in public life in the bill, a specified person in public life means a person who holds an office listed in Part 1 of the second schedule. And the second schedule makes reference to the following in Part 1. Members of the House of Assembly and the Senate, members of the Cabinet, permanent secretaries, heads of departments within the public service and holders of public offices in the same grade as that of such heads of department, chairpersons of the state-owned enterprises listed in Part 2, chief executive officers, general managers, and other executive heads of the state-owned enterprises listed in Part 2, magistrates, director of public prosecutions, auditor general, members and senior officers of the commission. Mr. President, these groups of persons, and I recall, I believe it was Senator Moore, that as it relates to the heads of department, she surmised that that could be anyone between S1 and S6. But these persons need to know what this bill is about. I personally spoke to a magistrate when we were doing the joint select committee meetings. She didn't know about the meetings or the bill. I spoke to a couple of persons who are heads of departments within the public service. They did not know about the bill. I do not believe that it was enough just to put a few ads in the newspaper and invite people to come into the Senate. I believe that this bill should have been treated the same way that the boss legislation was treated, where persons were not only told about it and you had buy-in from the trade unionists, but they set up, Lord, some trade unionists, Mr. President, where they set up meetings at the gymnasium and discussed it with the persons that were to be affected. Then I understand there were meetings held within certain organizations that to have them at the gymnasium, it would have been too many people. This is how that bill was treated, that piece of legislation was treated, the boss legislation. And it's a perfect example of how something like integrity ought to have been treated. This integrity in public life. You are imposing a new set of conditions onto persons' contract of employment, as it were, that they can't get out of, because to fail to declare is not only publication in the official gazette, but you are faced with a potential fine of up to $50,000. So you're going to be put into the official gazette, and you still have to pay a fine. You needed to discuss this and prepare people for it. Because once this is passed, you have, I think, a 90-day period to comply. You also have, Mr. President, another category of person. That category of person is persons exercising public function. They include, and that is also in the definition section of the bill, all specified persons in public life, public officers, members, chief executive officers, managers, directors, and employees of state-owned enterprises, and all other persons who hold a legislative, executive, administrative, or judicial office in the government of Barbados, whether appointed or elected, permanent or temporary, or paid or unpaid, but does not include a judge of the Supreme Court. That's a whole set of people, Mr. President. Do they know that the spouse included and the dependent children? Do they know? All I'm asking is if they know. If they know, proceed with your legislation. If they don't know, you got to give the people a minute to understand it. Because let's continue with the requirements. A person, this is clause 11, Mr. President. A person who is a specified person in public life shall, not may, I've taught you all what shall means, within 90 days of the appointed day and on or before the biennial anniversary of the appointed day, at some point somebody will explain that to me, becomes a specified person in public life shall, within 90 days from the day on which he becomes a specified person in public life, or C, listen carefully, ceases to be a specified person in public life shall, within 90 days from the day on which he ceases to be a specified person in public life, file in accordance with subsection 3 a declaration containing the particulars set out in subsection 5. So you could be out of public life, but you still got to make your declaration here. And section, I believe, clause 32.3, let us not be confused, says, 32.3 says, an inquiry shall not be commenced after 5 years from the date on which a person ceases to be a specified person in public life or other person exercising public functions as the case may be. Which means, Mr. President, that after you cease to be a member, you cease to be a person in public life, this commission, this bill, this legislation keeps you 5 years after you cease being a person in public life, you are still beholden to this legislation. Your spouse and your dependent children. You know what's get you from not having to deal with this? If you die. They worry with you if you die. Now, there may be research that supports this position. There may be reasons to support this position. But you need to tell the people who are going to be affected by this that this is the position. If you look at the people who made submissions, and if you look at the people who came and made oral submissions, I cannot remember, and my memory is not the same, but I do not remember if any of them fall into the second schedule, Mr. President. The people in the second schedule need to know what is going on and what will happen if this bill is passed. And I do not agree that you pass it and then tell them. We have permanent secretaries and we have heads of department that have been going to this and doing this and giving service to this country for double-digit years. You can tell them, like, by the way, but yet they can be put into the official gazette and humiliated and embarrassed, and they have to pay a fine? Really, Mr. President? And you're not telling them before it happens? How is that so, Mr. President? Let me continue. I made mention of the Declaration of Financial Affairs. A declaration, this is clause 11.5, Mr. President. A declaration shall be in the form 1 set out in the third schedule, and shall give full and true and complete particulars of A, the income, assets, and liabilities of the specified person in public life, and the income, assets, and liabilities of his spouse and dependent children. And you ain't telling the people? Oh. Clause 12, a specified person in public life shall disclose in his declaration such details in respect of his income, assets, and liabilities, and those of his spouse and dependent children, as by the exercise of reasonable care should be known to him, including any benefit accruing to his income and assets, and those of his spouse and dependent children, and any income, assets, and liabilities acquired, held, or incurred by any other person as agent or on behalf of himself and his spouse and dependent children, or any of them. There may be a need, Mr. President, to protect the country from fraudulent, corrupt people. That is not in dispute. What is important is that people know what the exposure is. Mr. President, Clause 16 deals with failure to file the declaration or to furnish information. Clause 16 says, where a person who is required to do so fails to file a declaration in accordance with this part, or to furnish particulars or other information or documents in accordance with Section 31, the Commission shall, not may, shall publish that fact in the Official Gazette and in a daily newspaper in general circulation in Barbados, and report the matter to the appropriate service commission, board, or other authority, and to the Director of Public Prosecutions, setting out such details as it considers appropriate, Mr. President. Clause 17, Mr. President, deals with offenses in respect of declarations. A person who, without reasonable cause, fails to file a declaration that he is required to file, A, B, that was A, sir. B, knowingly files a declaration that is incomplete or false in any material particular, or without reasonable cause fails to comply with the direction given under Section 14.2, etc., is guilty of an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $50,000 or imprisonment for 1 year or both. You got to tell the people, Mr. President, the government has to tell the people before they pass the legislation. This is not a inky-dinky piece of legislation. My word. It is not a joke piece of legislation. And I remember and I recall, look, you have statutory boards, and I believe it was Senator Grant saying he supports, my words, having heads of statutory corporations part of this. But, and that's fine, Mr. Senator Grant, but Mr. President, what this is going to do with this type of declaration, once people know, people will think twice about coming onto statutory boards or being chairman on a statutory board. And that's a shame, because you will find that if you use people from within the private sector on statutory boards, you have the benefit of their knowledge, expertise, their job background, their specific area, their areas of expertise. When we have this kind of legislation, it may affect those persons, but you know what? If they know and they come on the board, they're good. If they don't know, you have a problem. This is not something that you can spring on people. And if we pass this today, we will have the effect of springing it on people. Because whether you like it or not, enough people do not know about it. And they certainly don't know the extent that it reaches. It is a far-reaching piece of legislation. The advertisements were, and they were, you had the advertisements, yes, but treat it like boss. Show them, explain to them, highlight, because let's talk about the declaration, Mr. President. The Form 1 at the back of the legislation, Mr. President, of the third sketch, I beg your pardon. Yes. Form 1 in the third schedule, which starts on page 61 of the bill. Listen, it makes provision if there is insufficient space for the items falling under any part of this form, additional information may be provided on separate sheets. Senator Walker may need, so when we look at this Form 1, Mr. President, there are things, for example, on page 71, Part 3, real property. Address and description of property, including land and floor areas. In whose name held? Source of funding, mortgage, loan, savings. This bill is calling for that type of information. Then we have, for example, page 75, cash and valuables held in safety deposit boxes. Name and address of institution, description of cash and valuables, in whose name held. We have any other assets on page 81, Mr. President. Any other assets not herein previously declared, including boats, let me pause there, boats, which I think means yacht, jewelry, paintings, coin collections, etc. This is not a jokey bill. This has a lot of detail. There were a lot of meetings. There were a lot of revisions. None of that is in dispute. This is not how the bill started. It is a serious piece of legislation. But you have to tell the people who are going to be impacted. Mr. President, the number of bodies for which chairman will have to make the declaration range from the Air Transport Licensing Authority at number 1 and goes all the way to 54, ending with Urban Development Commission, Community Legal Services Commission, Child Care Board, Enterprise Growth Fund, Barbados National Oil, Barbados National Terminal Limited, Barbados Port Inc., National Conservation Commission, National Council on Substance Abuse. I can't hear you, so if you want me to hear. National Sports Council, Student Revolving Loan Fund, Transport Authority, Transport Board. Mr. President, it's everyone that you can think of in alphabetical order. 56, 52, how many there are? You have to tell the people. This is not just an individual. This is the individual, their spouse. Wait, spouse is defined because these days spouse means so many different things.
Order.
Okay, so this one has it as a person to whom the specified person in public life is married, or with whom the specified person in public life is in a union other than marriage. Wow. Mr. President, we have this situation where people don't know. My other concern, Senator Grinnell said it, that he hopes that the persons on the commission will not be partisan. Well, yeah. Let's pause on that.
Insofar as you're advising those who don't know, you only have about 2-3 minutes left.
Yeah, that's fine, Mr. President. I'm going to wrap up shortly. As it relates to the confidentiality, well, Senator Moore dealt with Section 19, where you have a register for those of us who are in Parliament that's available to the public. I'm hearing things about that clause, but it's still here today, so I will speak as if it is to remain. But my concern is the oath of secrecy. And we are to treat this like it's a confidential environment. But, Mr. President, in Barbados, we have a serious, serious issue with the leaking of information. Last week, the Prime Minister did a reshuffle. Last week, Wednesday to be exact. But while we were still in this house and before she spoke, on social media, you were seeing her car at the black and white roundabout going up to Government House with a caption saying, she's going up to Government House, a reshuffle is imminent. On social media. Picture of the vehicle at that roundabout at the bottom of Government Hill, the one that has the black and white stripes. Then she, and to some extent, you even knew some of the people who were being shuffled before it was announced. We also had a situation where, in relation to the passing of the late former Prime Minister. Barbados is not easy. Persons were speaking of his passing before it was announced. So my question is, how are we keeping this information? How confidential will it really be? And more importantly, based on the number of persons in the second schedule, where are you keeping this volume of information to guarantee the confidentiality that this legislation demands must ensue because of the nature of the information that is supposed to be declared pursuant to this legislation, Mr. President? In closing, Mr. President, I'm saying the issue is not whether we need this legislation. The issue is, has it been properly ventilated in the public domain, especially to the persons who are going to be affected by it? And do we not owe it to them to give them an opportunity to become aware of it, to be apprised of it, similarly to that which obtained with BOSS? I say you need to tell the persons, particularly those persons referred in the second schedule of this proposed legislation, Mr. President. And with that, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you. Senator Dr. Crystal Haynes.
Good afternoon, Mr. President and colleagues. I rise this afternoon to make a brief contribution in support of the Integrity in Public Life Bill. So under the last administration, we heard the former Prime Minister say that integrity cannot be legislated. And I remember the public ire that that comment drew at the time because, you know, to a certain extent, people couldn't believe that this could be a credible statement from a head of state at a time when there was so much speculation about malfeasance and misappropriation of funds. But when you really think about why he said it, you have to understand that not everyone has the same moral and ethical moorings. Not everybody could have the moral courage of Mandela or the honesty and consistency of Mother Teresa or the conviction of Gandhi. So the purpose for us being here today is to seek to finally bring to fruition a piece of legislation that will hopefully restore the public trust in us as public officials, high-ranking public officials, and in public servants as well. We saw previous administrations make attempts to do something a bit similar to reduce corruption at a national level. Obviously, the Tom Adams administration, more than 35 years ago, would have seen their draft bill pass the House of Assembly and subsequently fail in the Senate. The David Thompson administration had promised during their 2008 election campaign that within 100 days of being elected that they would seek to bring corruption prevention legislation and integrity legislation, and that is yet to be seen. The immediate past Prime Minister, the same one that made reference to the fact that integrity could not be legislated, his administration actually managed to pass a Prevention of Corruption Act that up to this day has never been proclaimed. But when you look at why, I mean, he actually stood in defense of a 90-year-old piece of legislation where the maximum fine is $2,400 Barbados dollars, I believe. So I believe that what we're doing today is important, it's necessary, and it is taking us to the next level in terms of restoring public trust and restoring trust not just in us, but in public institutions. A comment had been made that the legislation is being sprung on people, and another comment was made about rinky-dinky legislation. And I don't believe that those comments are fair, because we are finally at this point after almost 2 years of this bill in its initial form having been brought. Subsequently, we had seen the formation of a joint select committee that had close to 20 meetings. Not only was the bill subject to the process in joint select committee, which received multiple oral and written submissions, but we would have heard of the advertisements, not just in radio and print media. The bill had been published in the post offices, in the government printeries, was streamed live on the radio, on 100.7 and on social media. And I actually think it's so ironic, because it would be hard for any of us in here to say that there will be somebody in Barbados who does not know about this bill and what it's trying to accomplish, when overwhelmingly it has been the general public not asking but demanding that legislation like this be brought into place. And the reality is that it's no surprise that the public would call for something like this, because we are just 2 years past a government that, honestly, the kind of questions that have to be raised. I mean, we look at the Auditor General's reports. I took the opportunity to look through some of the issues related to the Auditor General's reports in the past government. One of the most startling things to me related to statutory corporations, because in reality that's where a lot of the investigations had to take place because of inconsistencies in how money had been managed. They said about $1.5 billion in goods and services passed through the Barbados Water Authority between 2010 and 2018. $1.5 billion. And of that, 90%, only 90% of that was not subject to public tender. Could you imagine? Over $1 billion in goods and services, less than 10% subjected to public tender. No transparency in the process. So many times the chairman signed off on a document, the board is unaware of it. The processes were not in place, and it's no wonder why questions have been asked. You saw a claim worth $5.8 million in legal fees claimed for Cahill, a deal that completely fell through. And you wonder why people are demanding it? Of course people are demanding it. It's not us pushing this on people. It's us actually, first of all, saving ourselves, because in being transparent, you get to regain public trust. We put a light on the actions and the transactions. We get to answer the who, the what, the where, the when, the how, and the how much. These are important questions that decision makers and people in power have to hold. And one of the things that needed to be addressed as well is the fact that I heard it said in this chamber that we as members of the Senate, we are not in a position where we necessarily get to influence decision making at a high level, or that we don't sign off necessarily on any of the big contracts or any of those things. Who are we? We're humble senators making what we make as a stipend. But the reality is we have a proximity to power and a perception of power that would still draw us into that net where we too have to be subjected to these terms. So I just want, in closing, to say that there is a real cost attached to corruption, because while as the past government would have been having all these issues related to overblown contracts and not actually fulfilling their obligations in terms of paying NIS and looking after the infrastructure, not paying VAT, not supplying the QEH with what was needed to operate the hospital, not buying a garbage truck, and not buying a bus. Simultaneously, we had a situation where SOEs were running amok and doing what they felt like because there was not the legislative framework in place to hold people to account and to demand the transparency that is necessary to actually keep us functioning in a way that would draw the respect of the public and would also restore dignity to public life. So in conclusion, I want to say that this is a watershed moment in Barbados' history. I'm proud to be a member of the Parliament at this time, and I'm proud to support this bill.
Mr. President, I want to beg that this sitting be now suspended for lunch to resume at 2:45. Thank you.
The question is that this session be now suspended until 2:45. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it, and we are now at lunch.